Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of our Kotlin Multiplatform social media app series. I'm Patrick and today we'll be tackling two screens in our app, the followers and the following screens. This video is going to be a bit different from the usual because we are going to combine both the shared code and the Android presentation layer code in one go. This is because first we have already worked on some part of the follow feature when we wrote the home screen code specifically for following suggested users during the onboarding process. Also, the UI code for these screens is already done. We prepared it earlier using some fake data because at that point our backend wasn't fully ready. Alright, now without further ado, let's get started. Alright, let's start by jumping into our shared module. We need to open follows API service class because this is where we'll need to add a new method to fetch the followers and following data. Here we need to scroll down and right below get followable users, we will need to define a new method called getFollows. This method will take in several parameters: the user token, the user ID, the page size, and follows endpoint. Here is the body for this method. Let's break down what's happening here. We are using client.get to make a get request to our backend. The endpoint function sets the path to the endpoint we want to hit, which will vary depending on whether we are fetching followers or following, hence this follows endpoint parameter. Then we add query parameters for user ID, page and page size to handle pagination and filtering. We also call setToken to include the user token in the request headers for authentication. Finally, the response from this call is returned as a follows API response object. This object was already defined in our remote follows models.kt file, so here we are just utilizing it to handle the response data in a structured way. Great. Now that we have our getFollows method in follows API service, let's move on to the next step. We need to update our repository layer to make use of this new API call. First, let's open up the follows repository interface. Now below follow or unfollow, we need to define a new method called getFollows. This method takes in the user ID, the page size, and follows type integer. Now let's move on to the follows repository implementation class where we'll add the implementation for this new method. Now right below this follow or unfollow method, we need to override this newly added method inside our interface. Now here is the code to add to the function body. Let's break down what's happening in this implementation. We start by switching to the IO dispatcher since network calls should not run on the main thread. Next, we get the current user data from user preferences to get the authentication token. We call getFollows from follows API service, passing in the necessary parameters. Notice how we are using the follows type to determine whether we are fetching followers or following by dynamically setting the follows endpoint. Then we check the status code of the response. If it's http status code.ok, we map the return data to a list of follows user domain object. Otherwise, we return error with the message from API response. We handle two exceptions here: an IO exception for network related errors, passing a no internet error message, and a generic throwable for any other exceptions that may occur. Before we move on to the use case, let's take a moment to clean up our code a bit. If you've been following along, you may have noticed that we often repeat the same pattern in our repository implementation classes, moving API calls to a background thread and handling errors in the catch blocks. To avoid this repetition and make our code cleaner and more maintainable, we are going to refactor this logic into a common utility function. Expand the util package is inside this common directory, and from here we are going to create a new Kotlin file named API call. Select file and hit enter. In this file we are going to add two functions: save API call and default error handler. Now here is the code for save API call function. Now let's go through what this function does. Save API call is a generic function that takes a dispatcher an optional error handler function, and the actual API call as a lambda. It runs the API call on the dispatcher IO to keep our network operations off the main thread. Inside the try block, we execute the API call. If it throws an exception, we catch it in the catch block. Now here is the critical point. We check to see if the exception is of type cancellation exception. If it is, we rethrow it. This is extremely important because cancellation exceptions are used to cancel coroutines. If we don't rethrow them, our coroutine cancellation logic will break. This has been a common mistake in our previous implementations, and it can lead to subtle bugs that are hard to track down. Always remember to rethrow cancellation exception if you ever write a catch block that catches such a generic exception like throwable or any of the cancellation exception supertypes. After that, we call error handler to handle any other exceptions. Next, let's add the default error handler function. Below Safe API call, we will define a new private function, default error handler. This function is a simple utility that converts exceptions into our result.error object. It checks if the error is an IO exception, which usually indicates a network issue, and returns a corresponding error message. For all other exceptions, it returns a generic exception or the exception message if available. Now let's go back to repository implementation class and make use of Safe API call. From here, I need to copy everything inside the try block. I will cut that instead. Then we can remove all this code after the return keyword. We need to return Safe API call, and we'll pass in here the dispatcher. Then for the API call lambda, I'm going to paste the code that we had inside the try block. Now you can follow the same process to update all the repository implementation classes. And as always, you can find the updated code on my GitHub repository. All right, now next we need a use case. Let's go ahead inside use case package and create a new Kotlin file. We are going to name that as getFollows use case. Here is the code for getFollows use case. Let's break down what this class does. This class implements coin component, which allows us to use coin for dependency injection. By declaring follows repository with by inject, we tell coin to provide an instance of follows repository when this use case is created. The main function here is the invoke operator function. This function makes the use case callable like a function itself. It takes in the necessary parameters, the user ID, the page size, and follows type. In the body of this invoke function, we call a getFollows from follows repository, passing in the parameters. This will return a result object that will either contain a list of follows user object on success or an error message if something went wrong. Now let's expand the DI folder and open shared module.kt file. We need to tell coin how to create or provide an instance of getFollows use case. So here we are going to use factory to tell coin that it should provide a new instance each time that we inject getFollows use case. In the contrary, for example, when we use single, like for follows repository, we instruct coin to provide only one instance or a singleton of follows repository for the lifetime of our application. All right, we are done with the shared module. In the next section, we are going to integrate this use case into our view model and connect it with the presentation layer. The view model is where we manage UI-related data in a lifecycle conscious way. In this step, we will ensure that we efficiently fetch and display our followers and following data. First, let's open up follows viewModel.kt. We need to make some modification to handle paginated data loading and integrate our newly created use case. We will modify the follows viewModel constructor to accept an instance of getFollows use case. Next, we need to manage our follows data in chunks for efficient loading and updating. For that, we will declare a new letInit property of type paging manager. let's go ahead and import paging manager. Now you can see that this time the type argument is of type follows user. Now let's define a method in the view model to initialize the paging manager. This method will take the user ID, follows type as parameters, and set up the paging logic. Now in here we need to return a default paging manager and pass in the lambdas. Now for onRequest lambda, we need to call a getFollows and we'll pass in the necessary parameters. We specify the user ID, the page number, the page size, and whether we are looking for followers or following. Now for the onRequest lambda, for the onSuccess lambda, here we need to handle the success state by updating the UI state with the newly fetched follows data. Now, of course, we are not using our sample data anymore, so we need to scroll down and we can change this attribute here from sample followers. Let's rename that. Okay, so we will call it as follows users. Of course, we need to change from sample follows user to our follows user from the domain package. All right, now let's not forget to also include a new property, val and reached, and the default value will be false. All right, now in the onError lambda, here we need to update the UI and set this error message to our error message property. Then lastly, for onload state change, here we just need to update our UI state and set the isLoading to it. Next, we need a way to define and handle different UI actions. So below follows UI state data class, let's define a sealed interface to represent these actions. This interface will have two actions, a data class for fetch follows action. This is to fetch the initial follows data, and a data object load more follows action for loading additional data when the user scrolls to the bottom of the list. Now, as always, let's scroll, and below this create paging manager method, we are going to define a new method for onUI action to handle different follows UI action cases. We also need a method to load more follows when requested. So above this onUI action method, we will define a new private method load more follows. Now this method checks if we have reached the end, and if that's the case, it returns. Otherwise, it launches a new coroutine and call paging manager.load items. Finally, let's update the fetch follows method to use our paging manager. Now I will remove this code here and paste the following. Now here's what this code does. It sets the loading state to true and introduces a small delay to mimic network latency. This is because we are still developing our backend locally. Then it checks if paging manager has been initialized. If not, we will enter this block. Then it initializes it using our create paging manager method and immediately start loading items. And that's it for the view model. With these changes, our view model is fully equipped to handle paginated loading of follows data, seamlessly integrating with our shared use case and repository logic. Now for the next step, let's open up followscreen.kt. We need to make the following changes. Now to follow screen composable, we are going to pass a user ID, the ID of the user whose followers or following we want to fetch, and follows type that indicate whether we are fetching followers or following. Then we need to replace fetch follows with onUI action and onItemClick with onProfile navigation. Now, of course, here we don't need this mapping anymore, so we can remove that. And instead of onItemClick, we need to call onProfile navigation. Then we can scroll down and we need to replace this launched effect with our updated launch effect. Okay, now to show the loading more indicator, we can simply copy this code here and inside our lazy column. Now we need to change the condition here is not empty. We need to check if the UI state is loading and we've got already some follows user fetched, and in that case we are going to call load more items. All right, now next we need to update followers and following.kt to reflect the changes in follows screen. Of course, for the user ID, we'll pass user ID, and for follows type, we'll pass 1. For on UI action, we will pass on UI action from view model, and for on profile navigation, we'll use our navigator to navigate to the profile destination. We will do pretty much the same inside following.kt. So let's copy this code and come here. And the only change that we need to make here is the follows type. Here we can set that to 2. Okay, then let's expand the DI package and open appmodule.kt. Here we need to instruct coin to inject the getFollows use case to our follows view model. All right, now we can run the application and let's move on to testing. All right, now the app has launched and let's try to navigate, for example, to Mr. Deep profile. And then from this profile, we can click on this followers. Okay, so actually we retrieved the followers for Mr. Deep, but none of them has a profile image. We are going to fix this in a moment. Let's try to go to see the followings. Okay, even Obed and John Sion don't have profile. If we click here, okay, so actually John has a profile image, but it doesn't show here. Okay guys, now to fix those errors, I have actually noticed that this is not the logic we want to load more items. Instead, let's quickly open post screen.kt, and here we need to copy the code that define this should fetch more post derived state. So you can copy that and come here inside follows screen. We will paste that here. Oh, what did I copy? Okay, let me go back and copy this and we'll paste that here. Okay, let's rename this derived state to should fetch more follows. Right, then we need to pass the list state to our lazy column. Okay, then we can go inside profile screen.kt and we will copy the launch defect to load more items. Coming inside follows screen, we can paste that below this first launch defect, right? Okay, let's try to take this suggested code. So we will try to fetch more if the UI state.end is not reached. And in that case, we are going to trigger a new UI action, follows UI action.load more for load more follows action. Then we need to add a third condition here. We need to check if the UI state is loading, and there are some follows users that have been already fetched. And the third condition is that we have not reached the end of our pagination. Only in that case, we will show the loading more indicator. Now for the image URL not showing, we are going to make our follows list item take a nullable image URL. So let's command click here and we'll make the image URL nullable, right? And then coming here, when we call our image URL, if this is not null, we need to call to current URL like this, and we can import that. All right, now let's relaunch our application and test. All right, now the app has launched. I would go ahead and click on Mr. Deep to navigate to Mr. Deep profile. And let's click on this followings. All right, so it loads the two following for Mr. Deep. Let's try and click on this John profile, and then it navigates us to John's profile. We can now click on the followers, and of course, since it's just Mr. Deep, it should normally show our own profile. And what you can see here is that if I click on this following, because John has no following, it just shows a blank screen, Now, to solve this, you could, for example, introduce a new property in our UI state class that indicates when we fetched the user but the return list was empty, so that in the UI you can show a custom message telling the user that this person has no following. Alright guys, now that's it for this episode where we have worked on fetching and displaying the follows data for a given user. Now in the next episode, we are going to work on the edit functionality of our application. We will first write the shared code, and in the episode after that, we will implement the presentation layer code. And then we will remain only with one big feature to implement, and that is uploading new posts. Alright, so as always, take care. I will see you in the next episode. Bye.